Ivy Hayes set her father's brass key on the scarred counter and listened to it stop ringing in the wood, as if the shop itself needed proof that she had truly come back and meant to remain. The old press stood under a canvas sheet in the front room, iron ribs catching strips of lamplight through the boarded window. While above it, the attic ceiling sloped so low she had to bow her head to cross to the bed. Ink, dust, and damp paper lived in the walls. She had one trunk, one wash basin, and 3 crates of ledgers tied in twine, and every object she had chosen to bring had the same weight in her hand: necessary, unfashionable, defensible. She had left her mother's townhouse before dawn 3 days earlier, not with an announcement but with a single bag, and the quiet precision of a person refusing to be stopped. By noon, she had paid the locksmith with the last notes in her purse and opened the print shop rooms her father had kept long after profit left them. By evening, she had found what she had come for. Lease books marked Dock Row, each page lined with cramped entries in her father's disciplined hand, each widow's name bracketed against terms that had not yet expired. Not charity, obligation, not hers by law, perhaps, but hers by memory and by the sort of arithmetic that did not appear in court. At the edge of midnight, she sat on an upturned crate and copied names into a fresh index, left wrist aching, fingers smudged black, lips moving as she checked each date against each rent note. Mrs. Ellen Price, lease to Michaelmas, reduced by 2 shillings during flood year. Mrs. Nora Bell, rent held at widow's rate by covenant, witnessed and stamped. She wrote them in people's order rather than property order, because that was how she remembered their doors and voices, and because she had once watched her father refuse to evict a woman who offered him only a broken kettle and an apology. "Paper is where mercy hides," he had told her then, tapping the margin with his thumb. "They will call it sentiment when they want to take it." The knock came just after 6 in the morning, sharp and proprietary. Ivy crossed the front room and opened the side door to find her mother's footman in a polished coat that looked absurd against the soot-dark brick lane. He held out a folded card as if he were delivering an invitation and not an order. "Mrs. Hayes requests your presence at 11, miss." Ivy broke the seal in the doorway. No salutation. "Attend at once. Business regarding your future." She looked up at the footman, whose eyes remained fixed just beyond her shoulder, trained to avoid the embarrassment of seeing her in a wool skirt she had mended at both hems. "Tell my mother I received it." He bowed and turned without comment. She shut the door and stood with the card in her hand until the grain pressed into her palm. The room was cold enough that her breath showed near the panes. She fed kindling into the grate, heated water, and washed at the basin with a cloth, already frayed thin at the corners. When she pinned her hair, she used plain steel instead of pearl. The pearl comb sat wrapped in linen in the trunk under her bed, one of the last things of value she still possessed. She left it there. By 11, she was climbing the townhouse steps she had climbed all her life, where the marble had been polished to a pale shine, and the brass rail never kept a fingerprint long. A maid she did not know opened the door, glanced once at Ivy's cuffs, and stepped aside with the expression reserved for tradesmen and unfortunate relations. Her mother received her in the blue morning room, where the curtains filtered the daylight into a flattering softness, and nothing smelled of work. Mrs. Beatrice Hayes sat upright on a silk settee in grey satin, ring steady on the armrest, profile precise enough to belong on a coin. Beside the fireplace stood Alderman Cole, broad-shouldered, hands clasped behind his back, his watch chain bright against his waistcoat. Neither of them offered to sit her down. "Ivy," Beatrice said, and even her daughter's name arrived trimmed of warmth. "You have made your point. You may return home now." Ivy removed her gloves finger by finger, set them on a side table, and kept her voice level. "I have moved out, Mother." Cole gave a soft laugh that did not reach his eyes. "A dramatic gesture, Miss Hayes. We are beyond theatrics." Beatrice did not look at him. "Your attic lodging ends today. I have instructed Mr. Hales to remove your trunks." "I have one trunk." "Then that will simplify the task." The sentence landed with the weight of routine cruelty, delivered as if discussing laundry schedules. Ivy felt the base of her throat tighten, then settle. She had expected rage. Boredom was worse. Boredom meant decision already made. She turned to her mother. "You had no right." "I have every right. The funds are mine to administer until your marriage settlement is executed, and your refusal to cooperate has become expensive." Cole stepped closer, filling the hearthlight. "Your mother has shown unusual patience. The town has business to conduct. Dock Row requires consolidation, and sentiment cannot govern municipal rates." Ivy met his gaze. His eyes were pale, unreadable in the manner of men who believed records existed only to ratify what they had already decided. "The leases are current," she said. "You cannot clear occupied cottages under emergency transfer while covenants stand." "You speak with confidence for a woman who has never held office," he replied. Beatrice lifted a hand, ending the exchange as if dismissing servants. "This is not a forum. It is a correction. You will cease this cataloguing project. You will surrender any Hayes ledgers in your possession to Mr. Cole's office by Friday, and you will marry him within the month. The bans can be read immediately." Ivy did not move. Beatrice continued in the same even tone. "A daughter's usefulness is contractual. You are 27, not 17. You will not be financed as an independent conscience." For a moment the room narrowed to the ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel. Ivy could feel her pulse in her fingertips. She looked at her mother's rings, at the smooth certainty with which Beatrice wore a life built partly on the work of a man now gone, and a daughter now inconvenient. She asked, "Is this your final word?" Beatrice gave a slight nod. "Yes." Ivy turned to Cole. "And yours?" He inclined his head once. "It is settled." She picked up her gloves. "No." Cole frowned as if he had misheard a clerk mumbling figures. "Miss Hayes?" "No." She walked to the door before either of them answered. Behind her, Beatrice spoke without raising her voice. "If you leave this house on that answer, you do so without name, room, or bread." Ivy paused with her hand on the latch. Her shoulders stayed square. "Then I will bring my own," she said, and stepped into the corridor. The maid at the front hall avoided her eyes as she passed. Outside, carriage wheels hissed over wet stone, and flower sellers called the noon prices in voices hoarse from cold. Ivy descended the townhouse steps without haste, though her knees trembled once at the bottom, and she had to stand still until the sensation passed. She did not look back. She crossed to the omnibus stand, paid the fare with 2 coins she could not spare, and sat between a seamstress carrying hat boxes and a man who smelled of coal smoke. Back at the print shop, she found that Beatrice had not waited for Friday. The lock to the attic had been forced, the lid of her trunk stood open, and 2 empty spaces yawned where folded dresses had been. They had taken the green wool coat and the winter blanket. They had left the ledgers, perhaps because no one in that house believed paper could be weaponry in a daughter's hands. Ivy knelt by the trunk, closed the lid, and tied it shut with cord. The room was colder now. She fetched her father's old work jacket from a nail by the stairs, rolled the sleeves twice, and returned to the crate that served as a desk. She made tea from leaves already used once, then twice, and forced herself to eat bread, gone hard at the crust. After that, She opened Ledger 4 and resumed indexing line by line as dusk thickened at the panes. By the first week of March, she had begun to mark each entry with 2 symbols, one for covenant protection, one for vulnerability under transfer law. The second mark appeared too often. She copied statutes from memory in the margins, then checked them against her father's annotations, looking for loopholes no one had closed yet. Late in the evening, when the candle guttered and wax slid over her knuckles, she wrapped the finished pages in oilcloth and tucked them beneath a loose floorboard behind the bed. If Beatrice sent another man with orders and a key, he would find dust and little else. Near 9, a second knock sounded, lighter than the first. This time it was Mr. Fenn, a junior clerk from Town Hall, cap in hand and damp at the shoulders. Miss Hayes, pardon the hour. Circular for known claimants and objectors. He held out a folded notice. Emergency rates meeting tomorrow. Dock Row transfer listed under Hart petition. Ivy took the paper, and the clerk shifted from one foot to the other. You did not hear it from me, he added, lowering his voice. But they mean to pass it quickly. Thank you, Mr. Fenn. He nodded and disappeared into the lane. She barred the door, opened the notice under the lamp, and read the agenda once. Then again. Transfer hearing at noon. Objections accepted at chair's discretion. Supporting documents to be tabled in duplicate. Her hand went to the stack of indexed pages. Not enough yet. Enough to begin. She cleared a space on the crate, set out blank sheets and sharpened her pencil with her father's penknife until the point came fine and exact. The city bells struck 10 while she copied citations and lease dates into 2 clean packets, each line straight despite the ache in her wrist. When the candle burned low, she moved it closer. When the draft threatened to kill the flame, she cupped her palm around it and kept writing. At midnight she stood, stretched her cramped fingers, and laid both packets side by side. Her name looked small at the bottom of each objection, ink still dark and wet. Ivy Hayes, claimant by record and covenant witness. She sanded the signatures, folded the pages, and tied them with ribbon cut from an old hem. Then she set the bundle beside the door with her gloves and the only decent coat she had left, so there would be no delay in the morning and no room for second thought. She lay down, fully dressed, on the narrow bed, and did not sleep so much as drift in shallow intervals, waking each time the floor settled or a cart passed in the lane below, one hand reaching in the dark toward the bundle by the door, as if to confirm that paper still existed and morning had not undone her resolve. When the church bell struck 5, Ivy rose before the last note died, buttoned her worn coat, and carried 2 tin pails to the parish pump at the corner of Bride Lane. The queue had already formed, laundresses with red knuckles, a baker's apprentice yawning into his sleeve, Mrs. Bell from Dock Row wrapped in a shawl that had lost half its fringe. Breath clouded in front of every face. No one wasted words at that hour. Ivy took her place behind Mrs. Bell and shifted the pails from one hand to the other when her fingers numbed. "You are up early for a lady of ledgers," Mrs. Bell said at last, with a small sideways glance that held neither mockery nor surprise. "I had papers to finish." Mrs. Bell looked at the pails, then at Ivy's cuffs, where old ink stains had outlived soap. "They said at market the aldermen mean to close us out before quarter day." "They mean to try," Ivy answered. The older woman's mouth tightened. "My Thomas put a shelf in that front room with his own hands. If they clear us, I cannot carry it." Ivy adjusted her grip on the handles. "Then we do not let them clear you." Mrs. Bell gave one dry nod, as if accepting terms in a contract she had no power to draft, but would honour all the same. At the pump, iron screamed against iron. Water spilled, splashed boots ran in silver channels between stones. When Ivy's turn came, she filled both pails to the brim, one for herself and one for Ellen Price, 2 doors over, whose wrist had swollen so badly she could not lift a kettle. By 5:30 she was back at the print shop, shoulders aching from the carry. She left one pail at Mrs. Price's step with a folded note tucked beneath the handle, then climbed to the attic, lit the stove, and spread her papers in order. Objection packet, lease extracts, covenant references, duplicate copies tied in ribbon. She counted each page twice and slipped them into her satchel between 2 pieces of cardboard to keep them from bending. On the crate beside the lamp lay a coat she had promised to mend for a dock porter's wife, elbow split wide. Ivy threaded a needle while the kettle warmed and worked 3 neat rows across the tear, measuring each stitch against the next, because her hands needed one practical task before the public one. At 7 she ate the heel of yesterday's loaf with tea gone thin and copied numbers from memory on the back of an old broadside. Arrears for 6 households, coal costs rising, 2 rents partially paid in soap and lamp oil. The arithmetic did not improve by being looked at, but she looked anyway. If the transfer passed, those columns became eviction schedules. If it failed, they became survival plans. She folded the sheet and set it under the satchel flap. By 8, Town Hall had opened its records room to petitioners, though opened meant a side door, a narrow table near the coal scuttle, and clerks who behaved as if any woman asking to see deed books had misunderstood both custom and grammar. Ivy gave her name to the porter and received the same blank expression she had received every day that week. "You again, Miss Hayes," Mr. Pike said from behind the registry counter without lifting his eyes from his quill. "Yes, Mr. Pike." Still upon Dock Row? Still upon law? He sniffed, perhaps at the answer, perhaps at the damp hem of her skirt, and pushed Ledger C toward her with 2 fingers, as one might pass stale bread to a stray dog. Ivy carried it to the narrow table and opened to the transfer index. The script changed across the years, hands thick and thin. Some flourished, some clipped. She copied entries into her own notebook, then checked them against the packet in her satchel. Lot numbers, survey marks, witness initials. In 3 places the margins had been trimmed so close, the final letter of a surname had vanished. She noted each cut with calm precision. Around her, routines settled like dust. The clerk nearest the window coughed every 4th line. A messenger in muddy boots came and went with rolled notices. 2 merchants argued over warehouse frontage in low, angry tones and fell silent when the chair's door opened. Ivy remained at her corner table, visible and ignored, the exact position to which women without office were assigned in every building that mattered. At 10, Mr. Fenn passed her table with a sheaf of notices and paused long enough to set a thin blue file beside her elbow. "Supplemental list for noon," he murmured, not quite looking at her. She opened it after he moved on. Emergency transfer docket revised. Dock Row appeared under petitioning entity, Heart Development Consortium. Beneath that, in a sharper hand than the first copy, a notation had been added. Claimant, present, by representative. Ivy drew in one breath, slow enough that her chest did not show the strain, and copied the phrase on the inside of her cuff with pencil. When the bell in the central corridor marked 11, she closed the ledger, returned it to Mr. Pike, and received no acknowledgement. Outside the records room, the public chamber was already filling, tradesmen smelling of wool and tar. 2 widows from Dock Row standing close together, 1 curate, 3 men from the mill office, and Alderman Cole near the front bench with his hat balanced on his knee. He saw Ivy enter and gave a glance of mild irritation, as if a draft had slipped under a closed door. She took a seat at the back long enough to sort her papers one final time. Petition copy to the left. Lease abstracts centered. Statutory citations clipped at the top with her father's brass clip, polished by years of use. Her name stood clear at the foot of each objection. No one had invited her to speak. She stood when the chair called Doc Rowe anyway. "The next matter," announced Chair Wilkes, tapping the gavel once. "Emergency transfer and rates consolidation petitioned under Hart." A man rose from the side aisle before Cole could. He wore a plain surveyor's coat, dark wool, cuffs clean but unadorned, and carried no visible insignia beyond a leather folio tucked under one arm. He was taller than she had expected from a seated silhouette, spare rather than broad. His hair was dark, cut short for practicality, and his face held the weathered reserve of someone accustomed to being watched without offering anything back. His eyes were grey, steady, nothing decorative in them and no uncertainty. "Elias Hart, appearing for the petition," he said. His voice was low and measured, each word set down like a weight placed carefully on a scale. He did not glance toward Ivy. He addressed the chair as if the room's mood were irrelevant and only procedure existed. "Doc Rowe has failed to meet sanitary and structural standards under subsection 12. Consolidation permits immediate correction, reduced rates burden, and efficient administration of lease obligations." Efficient administration. Ivy felt the phrase strike like cold water. She rose before the chair could recognize Cole. "Objection," she said clearly. "Filed in duplicate this morning. Ivy Hayes, claimant by covenant record." A ripple moved through the benches. Someone whispered her name, then someone else repeated it, with a slight lift of tone reserved for scandal and amusement. Chair Wilkes peered over his spectacles. "Miss Hayes, this is a rates session, not a domestic petition. It is both when private coercion seeks public effect." Cole half stood. "Mr. Chair, I protest this language." "Sit, Alderman," Wilkes said, irritated now at noise more than substance. "Miss Hayes, state your legal ground." Ivy stepped into the aisle, papers in hand. "Lease covenants signed under Hayes management remain active through Michaelmas for 9 occupied cottages. Emergency transfer cannot extinguish resident rights, absent breach proven lot by lot. No such proofs are filed in this docket." Hart turned his head then, finally looking at her directly. The expression did not alter, but attention sharpened. "The petitioner does not seek extinguishment," he replied, "only reassignment of obligations to a consolidated authority. Under a rates mechanism that removes individual hearing rights. Temporary. Unspecified. Standard in flood district actions. Doc Rowe is not in flood district designation this year." Their voices stayed formal, almost calm, yet the exchange tightened the room like drawn wire. Ivy laid one page on the clerk's table. "Lot 17, widow tenancy, rent reduced by covenant through Michaelmas. Lot 21, same. Lot 9, repairs outstanding by landlord default, not tenant breach. Your petition lists all 3 as transferable under immediate public necessity." "That is inaccurate." Hart opened his folio and withdrew a sheet. "Inspection notes indicate collapsed drains and unsafe foundations." "Then repair orders are proper. Mass transfer is not." He held her gaze for one beat longer than protocol required. "You are arguing policy in a procedural chamber, Miss Hayes. I am arguing people in a chamber that forgot them." For the first time, a visible reaction crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but a minute recalibration, as if a tool he had expected to fit one mechanism had found another. He set his sheet down. The petition was submitted in good faith. By whom? By Hart. That is not an answer. Chair Wilkes struck the gavel twice. "Enough. Clerk, read the deed summary and signatory line. We will determine standing before entertaining further rhetoric." The chief clerk, who had watched the exchange with pained fascination, adjusted his spectacles and unfolded the transfer deed from a long envelope. Parchment rasped. The chamber quieted to the scratch of benchwood and distant carriage noise through the high windows. Transfer instrument for Dock Row parcels 9 through 27, the clerk read. Petitioned under Hart Development Consortium. Trusteeship declared under Private Covenant Registry. Signed and sealed. He paused, frowned at the flourish, then continued more loudly. Signed and sealed by Elias Hart. A sound moved through the room, not one voice but many, a collective intake followed by whispers that travelled faster than reason. Ivy looked from the parchment to the man in the surveyor's coat, and the ordinary plainness of that coat became suddenly strategic, not humble, not incidental, deliberate. He did not deny it. He inclined his head once toward the clerk. Yes, he said, my name is on the deed. The whispering did not stop when Chair Wilkes struck the gavel. It swelled, broke into pockets, and rolled along the benches with the peculiar appetite of a room that had been offered scandal in place of procedure. Ivy remained standing in the aisle, one hand on her packet, while the clerk looked from her to Elias Hart and back again, as if searching for a version of the morning that could still be ordinary. "Order!" Wilkes snapped. "This chamber will not become a theatre. Standing is disputed. Docket deferred 48 hours pending verification of Covenant registry and occupancy schedules. Clerk, record it." Alderman Cole rose hard enough to scrape his bench. "Mr. Chair, delay imposes public risk." "Then submit your risk in writing," Wilkes said. "Sit down." Cole did not sit until everyone had seen him remain upright. When he did, his gaze cut to Ivy with flat irritation, then slid away from her as if she were less person than obstacle. The hearing dissolved by inches. Men gathered hats and opinions with equal speed. Two traders argued over whether Hart had outmaneuvered the alderman or joined them. Mrs. Bell, near the rear door, caught Ivy's eye and gave one brief nod that held gratitude and fear in the same line. Ivy began to collect her papers with deliberate care because she could feel the tremor in her fingers now that the speaking was done. She aligned edges, retied ribbon, and tucked the sheaf under her arm. She would not leave a single page for idle hands. On the town hall steps, midday mud had been churned to a slick brown glaze by carriage wheels and boots. People clustered in little knots under the stone lions, talking too loudly, pretending not to look at her. Ivy descended the first 3 steps, and then a shoulder struck her satchel from behind, not enough to knock her down, enough to send the top file sliding free. Pages fanned open towards the wet street. She moved fast, crouching, to catch the nearest bundle before it kissed the mud. Another hand reached the same sheet at the same moment, long fingers pinning the corner just above a puddle. She looked up into the grey eyes of Elias Hart. He did not speak immediately. He gathered the remaining pages with a surveyor's efficiency, turning each one so the damp did not touch ink, and handed the stack back in the order she had arranged it. She noticed, with a flicker of surprise she kept from her face, that he had preserved her sequence exactly. "Thank you," she said. He glanced at the top leaf, at the narrow columns she had drawn in pencil along the margin. "You indexed by household." "Yes." "Not by parcel." "People live there." A muscle shifted once in his jaw, then settled. Around them voices rose and fell, indifferent and curious by turns, but the space between the second and third step felt abruptly private, as if the noise had moved one pace farther away. He touched the edge of the page with one finger. "You read for people, not property." The sentence entered her like cold water, and then warmed, which was more disorienting than if he had mocked her. She drew the file closer to her chest. "Your deed still seeks transfer." His expression did not change. The chair has deferred transfer. For 48 hours. For now. He stepped back, giving her the stare and the street both. Do not lose those pages, Miss Hayes. They are better than most briefs I receive. She almost asked who sent him briefs, and why a man in a plain coat spoke as if municipal chambers were temporary inconveniences. Instead, she said, I had no intention of losing them. He inclined his head once, the same economical gesture he had given the clerk, and turned toward the side lane where petitioners' carts were waiting. Ivy stood still until the pressure of movement forced her down the remaining steps, her pulse unexpectedly uneven. She told herself the disturbance was from the hearing, from adrenaline and hunger, and the public scrape of Cole's contempt. It would have been easier if that had been true. 2 days later, under a sky the colour of pewter, Chair Wilkes ordered a joint inspection of Dock Row before the deferred docket reconvened, and Ivy found herself walking the lane beside Elias Hart, with Mr. Pike trailing behind them and pretending not to shiver. The row smelled of coal smoke, wet rope, and cabbage boiling somewhere behind thin walls. Mrs. Price had swept her stoop twice before they arrived. Children watched through cracked shutters and vanished when adults glanced their way. Ivy kept her notes folded in her glove. Lot 9 drain still backing, she said, indicating the brick channel where water stood stagnant. Reported 3 times. Pike muttered, Noted. Hart crouched beside the broken stone lip, pressed 2 fingers to mortar gone soft, and rose with his cuff darkened. Temporary braces on that wall, he said to Pike. Today, not next week. Pike blinked. By whose order? Right mine for the moment, Hart replied. If the chair objects, he may bill me, Pike wrote. At the parish pump near the end of the row, the handle gave a grinding protest and dropped uselessly. Mrs. Bell, who had followed them at a distance, folded her arms tighter over her shawl. It broke at dawn, she said. Cooper says no repair without advance payment. Pike sighed with bureaucratic fatigue. Parish maintenance request must be lodged through. Hart was already reaching into his coat. He drew out a leather purse, counted coins into his palm, and pressed them to Pike's notebook so the clerk had to stop speaking and take notice. Pay Cooper now, Hart said. Receipt to be delivered to Town Hall under street maintenance, not tenant charge. Mrs. Bell stared at the coins as if they might retract themselves. Sir, we can pay back in small portions. He shook his head once. You can draw water. Ivy watched the exchange from half a pace away. He had not looked at her while he did it. He had not performed generosity for witnesses. He had solved a mechanical problem and moved on to the next line in his inspection list. Yet by evening, every door in Dock Row would know who had kept the pump from failing through the weekend, and the knowledge would not come from him. When they reached Lot 21, he paused by a sill patched with old newspaper and spoke without turning. Your figures on arrears were accurate. She answered before she considered whether to answer at all. I measure twice. I noticed. Mr. Pike coughed into his fist and looked deliberately elsewhere. Ivy wrote the wall crack depth in her notebook and did not ask why being noticed by this man unsettled her more than being judged by men like Cole ever had. By the second week of March, the records room lamps burned late 3 nights running, and Ivy remained at the narrow table past closing because deferred hearings generated twice the paper and half the clarity. At 7:30 on Thursday, when even Mr. Pike had gone home, she heard the side door open and expected Mr. Fenn with notices. Elias Hart entered instead, carrying a map tube and 2 bound volumes she recognized at once from their spine stamps. County tenancy precedents, expensive and rarely loaned. He set them on the table opposite her. You cited subsection 12 against emergency extinguishment. You should also cite subsection 8 on continuity of burden when trustee names alter. She looked up sharply. That subsection addresses entail transfer. And municipal trusteeships linked to private covenants after the 14 revision. He opened one volume to a marked page and turned it toward her. Footnote 4. She read the passage, then the line below it, then the marginal annotation in an older hand. He was correct. It did not decide the whole question, but it narrowed Cole's argument by half. You are unusually literate in estate law for a surveyor, she said. He met her gaze without flinching. Survey lines are legal lines. Not at this depth. His mouth moved as if toward a smile, then stopped short of it. I had a rigorous clerkship. With whom? With a man who disliked sloppy thinking. The answer was both specific and useless. Ivy copied the citation anyway, her pencil moving quickly. He remained standing while she wrote, then reached for the second volume and opened to a case index already tagged with a slip of blue paper. Use this if Cole argues public sanitation supersedes tenancy. He will. Then be ready. She paused and looked at him fully. In lamplight, his face showed new details she had not seen on the town hall steps. A fine white scar at his temple hidden by his hairline, the worn crease at the knuckle where a ring might once have sat, hands calloused in ways that did not match a clerk's life, and did not entirely match a surveyor's either. "Why help me?" she asked. His eyes held hers for one measured beat. "I am helping the record." He left before she answered, and the room seemed larger after the door closed. Not emptier exactly, but altered. Ivy bent back to the page and wrote until her wrist cramped. She told herself assistance given to the record was still assistance. Motive could wait. Sunday came with thin sunlight and a biting wind that chased most conversation indoors. Ivy attended early service at St. Jude's, then crossed the churchyard to leave a basket of bread and onions at Mrs. Price's cousin's cart. Near the yew wall she heard boys laughing over a wooden hoop and turned in time to see one of them run straight into Elias Hart's leg. The child bounced backward, more startled than hurt, and stared up, wide-eyed. "Forgive me, sir." The title arrived unconsciously, the way children addressed men whose authority had been demonstrated often enough to settle into habit. Elias crouched to the boy's height, righted the tilted hoop, and checked the scrape on the boy's palm with brisk gentleness. "No damage done," he said. "Keep your eyes ahead on corners." "Yes, sir." A second child, older, tugged the first by the sleeve and whispered too loudly, "I told you he ain't just a measurer." Both boys froze when they saw Ivy watching, then bolted toward the gate, hoop rattling over stones. Elias straightened, dusted his hands, and turned to her, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Miss Hayes?" "Mr. Hart." Wind pushed a strand of hair loose from her pins. She tucked it back and held his gaze. Children are observant. They are also inventive. Are they wrong? He regarded her with that same still attention he brought to broken mortar and legal clauses. About which part? She could have pressed. The question was there, bright and almost audible between them. Instead, she shifted the basket higher on her arm. "About corners," she said. "I should keep my eyes ahead." Something like approval crossed his face, quiet and brief. A useful rule. He stepped aside to let her pass on the path, and she felt, absurdly, as if she had accepted terms in a negotiation neither of them intended to name. 3 evenings later, she entered the assembly rooms under borrowed lace and practical resolve, carrying a packet of tenant affidavits she needed 3 magistrates to witness before Friday's reconvened session. The spring subscription ball had drawn every person in town who wished to be seen discussing civic duty above polished floors and imported candles. Ivy had no dance card and no wish for one. She moved along the edge of the room, waited through 2 sets while men finished laughing, and obtained one signature from a magistrate's wife who understood paperwork better than her husband did. Alderman Cole watched her from near the musicians with open displeasure. Beatrice stood 3 paces from him in silver silk, speaking to a banker's widow without ever glancing toward her daughter. Ivy felt the old pressure at the base of her throat and kept moving. From the side stair that led to the servants' gallery, she caught sight of a plain, dark coat she recognized before she admitted she had been looking for it. Elias stood in the shadow behind the rail, not among dancers, not among petitioners either, speaking to the hall steward. A magistrate who had ignored Ivy twice that evening climbed the stair, listened to Elias for less than a minute, then descended at once and crossed the floor to Chair Wilkes with unusual speed. Wilkes read a folded note, frowned, and summoned the records clerk immediately, though no one announced why. Ivy remained where she was, half concealed by a column wrapped in white roses. Elias did not look toward her. He spoke again to the steward, then stepped back until the gallery shadow hid his face. Authority moved through the room in his wake without attaching to his name. Not a surveyor, not merely. She had 2 affidavits left to witness. She secured one by the supper table and the last near midnight, when the musicians slowed and men became easier to corner. As she tied the packet closed, she felt, rather than saw, Elias at her shoulder. "You should leave by the east door," he said quietly. "Cole has posted a man at the front vestibule to ask what papers you carry." Her fingers stilled on the ribbon. "On whose instruction?" He looked over the crowd, not at her. "Does it matter?" "It does to the record." A faint line appeared beside his mouth, almost wry. "Then write this line. Not all inquiries are lawful." She slipped the affidavits into her reticule. "And some warnings are unexpected." He turned his head then, just enough that she could see the steadiness in his eyes. "Take the east door, Miss Hayes." She held his gaze one breath longer, then gave a single nod. "Very well." When she reached the side corridor, she looked back once. From across the ballroom, through candle smoke and turning silk, she saw him in the gallery speaking to Chair Wilkes as if they were equals and old associates, and she knew with the cold clarity of an accounted sum that whatever name he had placed on the deed, it was not the whole of him. She took the east corridor exactly as he instructed, descended the servants' stair with her reticule pressed flat against her ribs, and stepped out into the narrow lane behind the assembly rooms, where kitchen ash and carriage steam mingled in the dark. The noise of the ballroom dulled to a muffled pulse behind brick. She did not look back a second time. At the lane's end, she found the posted man Elias had mentioned, broad in the shoulders and wearing Cole's colours on his lapel, waiting near the front vestibule and stopping guests with practised civility. He did not see her from where she stood in shadow beneath a rain barrel. She moved the other way, crossed 2 alleys and a delivery yard, and reached Bride Lane with her papers dry and unwitnessed by anyone who meant to count them. In the attic room, she set the affidavits on the crate, unpinned her hair with stiff fingers, and sat at the bed's edge until the room steadied around her. Her pulse still carried the ballroom's tempo, but beneath it ran a clearer line now. Elias Hart had authority that arrived in rooms before he did, and he had used it to shield her work without claiming to do so. She untied the packet, checked each page by candlelight, and copied the witnesses' names into her index before sleep could blur the spellings. By the following Thursday, Doc Rowe had stopped discussing signatures and begun discussing temperatures. The first fever appeared in a cooper's house near the pump, then in 2 rooms above the rope seller's shed, then in the narrow back quarters used by men who worked Elias Hart's survey teams and hired carts. The parish surgeon came once, left powder wrapped in paper, and did not return until called elsewhere. Water pails moved constantly. Doors stayed half open for air. Children were kept indoors and grew restless at windows. Ivy crossed from stoop to stoop with a kettle, vinegar, and lists. Which house had clean rags? Which needed broth? Which had coin for coal? And which had already sold the last chair that could be sold? She wrote each item beside each name because panic scattered memory, and paper did not. Near dusk, Mr. Doran, the coachman who drove one of Hart's teams on inspection days, met her at Mrs. Bell's step with his cap crushed between both hands. "Miss Hayes," he said, voice roughened by worry and fatigue. "I was told you know who can get fever draft on account. My boy took hot at noon. He is burning through blankets." Ivy looked past him at the lane where laundry lines hung still in the stale air. "How old is he?" 8. "Has he kept water down?" "For an hour, no." She nodded once. "Keep giving him spoonfuls, small often. I will come when I have supplies." He swallowed. "I have no ready money until Monday wages." "I did not ask for money." His shoulders dropped a fraction, almost a collapse, then caught again. "God keep you, miss." She did not answer blessing with blessing. She asked for his address, exact and repeated, then wrote it on the back of a used notice and folded it into her glove. At the apothecary on Mill Street, the apprentice behind the counter recognized her and gave the careful smile reserved for customers whose accounts were uncertain. "Miss Hayes, tincture and willow powder again?" "Twice the willow, camphor, and clean bandage cloth if you have any not already promised." He counted jars with quick fingers. "That will be £1, 3 shillings." She set her purse on the counter and opened it. 3 shillings and 4pence looked back at her from the worn lining. "I can pay 4 now," she said. "The remainder by fortnight's end." The apprentice's expression tightened with sympathy he had no authority to convert into credit. "Mr. Lyle has marked all deferred accounts suspended this week, miss. We are overextended from the dock wards." She closed the purse. Her palm stayed on it a moment longer than necessary, feeling the useless lightness through kid leather. Then she lifted her chin. "Keep the bundle wrapped. I will return within the hour." She left Mill Street at a measured pace until she turned into a narrower lane where no one from Town Hall walked by choice. The pawnbroker's window held 3 watches, 2 silver candlesticks, and a child's violin with 1 string missing. Ivy stood outside long enough to see her own reflection faintly over the cluttered glass. Plain brown wool, ink at the cuff, jaw set as if preparing for argument. She did not permit herself a second pause. Inside, the broker looked up from his ledger with mild surprise. "Miss Hayes." She unbuttoned her glove and drew the linen-wrapped comb from her coat pocket. Pearl set in a narrow arc of gold, once her father's gift to her mother, later passed down with instructions about proper occasions. She laid it on the counter and folded the linen beside it, so he could not pretend not to see the quality. "What sum?" He lifted it, turned it toward the lamp, and clicked his tongue softly at one tiny chip near the clasp. 16 shillings. "It is worth twice." "It is worth what I can recover." She met his eyes. 22. 19. 20, and you keep your margin. He held her gaze, then shrugged with mercantile resignation. 20. He counted coins into her hand, stamped a ticket, and slid it toward her. Redemption within 30 days. Ivy folded the ticket and placed it in the inner seam of her reticule, separate from tenant papers and rent lists, as if separation itself could protect one category of loss from another. When she stepped back into the lane, her hand went once to her hair by habit and found only plain steel pins. At the apothecary, she paid in full, took the wrapped medicines and cloth, and carried them across town to the mews where Doran lodged above the harness room. The stair smelled of hay, soap, and old smoke. In the single upstairs room the boy lay on a narrow cot with his curls damp against his forehead, breath fast and shallow, eyes closed tight as if light itself hurt. Mr. Doran's wife hovered by the hearth, wringing a cloth that had long ceased to cool. Ivy set down the parcel, washed her hands in a chipped basin, and began dividing powders with practical precision. "Half this in water every 2 hours," she said. "If he wakes, 1 sip first, then wait." Mrs. Doran nodded too quickly. "Will he mend?" "He has a chance. We keep him cool and watered." They worked without ceremony. Ivy cut bandage cloth into strips, soaked them, changed them, timed the doses by the church bell and the kitchen clock below. Mr. Doran went twice for fresh water and once for coal. The room's candle burned down, was replaced, burned down again. Fever rose, dipped, rose. At one point the boy opened his eyes and whispered for his father's hand. Mr. Doran gave it at once and did not let go. Hours deep into the night, when the mews had gone quiet and only distant carriage wheels marked the city's restlessness, Ivy carried the used basin to the landing and nearly collided with a figure standing in the doorway below. Elias Hart looked up from the stair's last step, hat in hand, coat dark with mist. He had the stillness of a man who had arrived fast and then forced himself not to show it. "How is he?" he asked. "Fever, but holding water now." His gaze moved past her toward the room where Doran sat bent over the cot. Doran sent no message. He did not wish to lose wages by leaving his post. "He has no post tonight." The words came clipped, then softened by a degree. "You have been here since evening." "Yes." He glanced at the basin in her hands, at the stack of cut cloth on the landing table, at the medicine wrappers with the apothecary's stamp. His eyes returned to hers. "You purchased these yourself." She shifted the basin against her hip. "The child needed them." "Miss Hayes." "If you are here to thank me, do not. Sit with your man so he can breathe once this hour." For the first time in days he smiled, brief and transformative, not because the situation was light, but because her refusal met something in him that recognized equal ground. "Very well," he said. "I will sit." She stepped aside. As he passed, he lowered his voice. "You should go home before dawn." "I will go when his temperature drops again." He inclined his head, accepting the amendment as if it were a clause he had expected to negotiate. Then he went into the room and took the hard chair by the wall without further speech. He did not issue orders. He remained present. Near first light, the boy's skin cooled enough that the cloth stayed cool for longer than a minute. Mrs. Doran wept silently into her apron, back turned so her son would not see. Ivy left as the sky paled over the mews roofs. She walked back to Bride Lane with stiff knees and medicine scent on her sleeves, climbed to the attic, and slept in her coat for less than 2 hours before the parish bell pulled her up again. 3 days passed before she returned to Mill Street to settle what she expected would be a second charge for replacement powders. Mr. Lyle himself stood behind the counter that morning, spectacles low on his nose, ledger open. "I have come about the Doran account," Ivy said, already untying her purse. He looked down the page, then back at her with polite confusion. "There is no balance due, Miss Hayes. There should be £1 and some shillings. Paid yesterday, entirely." "By whom?" Mr. Lyle adjusted his spectacles. "By bearer, with instruction that the entry read parish relief. No name left." She held his gaze a moment, then nodded. "Thank you for confirming." Outside the shop, street noise resumed around her in ordinary layers, cart axles, A fishmonger's call. Two girls laughing over ribbon they could not afford. Anonymous payment could have come from half a dozen sources in theory and one in practice. She did not permit herself the indulgence of certainty, yet warmth and irritation rose together all the same. He had watched, said little, and acted where the ledger could not refuse him. Again. By late afternoon she had copied 2 new affidavits and drafted an addendum to her objection, citing continuity burdens under revised subsection 8, the very footnote he had opened for her. The line between collaboration and opposition had become fine enough to cut skin if handled badly. She chose not to name it. She chose work. At dusk she crossed to the townhouse with her father's old key and the steadiness of someone entering a familiar building as a petitioner rather than a daughter. The maid at the door this time was one who remembered her childhood and looked stricken for one brief second before training returned. "Mrs. Hayes is receiving Alderman Cole in the study," the maid said. "I will wait in the corridor." The maid hesitated. "Miss Ivy—" "I will wait." The corridor outside the study held the same runner carpet, the same landscape engravings, the same faint scent of beeswax and rosewater that had clung to her mother's rooms for years. The door stood nearly closed, not latched. Voices carried through the narrow opening with cruel clarity. Beatrice spoke first, her tone level, businesslike. "Ivy is not difficult, merely expensive." Cole gave a short laugh. "Then expense must be reduced. Once married, her signature secures the transfer and the cottages clear by quarter day. Until then, keep pressure practical. No scenes." Ivy's fingers tightened on the doorknob until sensation thinned and then vanished. Breath shortened high in her chest, each inhale too shallow, as if the corridor had narrowed by inches. She heard Cole say something about bans and enforceability. She heard her mother answer, "A daughter signs where she is directed when allowances are withdrawn." The words landed as physical impact, methodical and precise, each one setting a fact in place she could not unhear. She opened the door and stepped into the study. Beatrice looked up with mild annoyance, as though interrupted during correspondence. Cole turned, colour rising at his collar, then settled into an expression of affronted authority. "Ivy," Beatrice said, "you were not announced." Ivy closed the door behind her and walked to the centre of the room, father's key cold in her pocket, pulse hard but even now. "The arrangement is finished," she said. "The arrangement is finished." Silence followed her words, not shocked, merely offended, the sort of silence that expected correction. Beatrice set down her teacup with exact care on the saucer and looked at Ivy as if she had interrupted a tailor over button placement. "You do not understand the arrangement well enough to finish it," she said. Cole came around the desk, one hand extended in a gesture meant to appear conciliatory, and landed instead as possession. "Miss Hayes, you are fatigued. Sit down. We can draft terms that preserve your dignity." Ivy did not sit. Her fingers had gone cold around the doorknob in the corridor, and were warm now, only because anger had restored sensation in sharp, controlled pulses. She looked first at Cole, then at her mother. "My dignity is not drafted by committee," she said. "I came for my father's correspondence, the covenant letters in his red dispatch case." Beatrice's expression did not alter. "Those papers are household property. They concern active leases and fiduciary duty. They concern whatever I decide they concern." Cole's mouth tightened. "You are in no legal position to demand family documents. Then I am in moral position to witness theft." He took another step, lowering his voice as if intimacy might secure obedience where authority had failed. "Miss Hayes, be prudent. A public quarrel will strip you of support." She held his gaze without blinking. Support for what, Alderman? My own signature on your transfer? Beatrice turned slightly toward Cole, bored already with negotiation. You see the problem: sentiment and dramatics. Ivy heard the line she had overheard in the corridor, merely expensive, like a pin sliding under the nail. She did not flinch. She reached into her pocket, drew out her father's brass key, and set it on Beatrice's desk, between the inkstand and Cole's gloved hand. I returned your house key, she said. You will return my father's letters. Beatrice looked at the key, then back at her daughter. No. Ivy nodded once, as if a clerk had confirmed an expected number. Noted. She turned to leave. Cole spoke to her back. If you walk out now, I will file notice that you have no standing in Hayes matters. She paused at the threshold, hand steady on the latch. File what you please. Beatrice's voice followed, low and flat. You have chosen hunger. Ivy opened the door. I have chosen record. She crossed the corridor past the maid who still remembered her childhood and had once tied her ribbons before school. The maid's eyes flicked toward the study door and then down again, training and sympathy, fighting visibly for 1 second. Ivy stopped, untied the thin gold chain at her throat, one of the last gifts from her mother's side of the family, and placed it in the maid's palm. For your brother's apprenticeship fee, Ivy said quietly. Do not thank me in this hall. The maid swallowed hard and closed her fingers around the chain. Yes, miss. Ivy left without looking back. The walk to Bride Lane felt both longer and narrower than usual, as if each street had shifted inward by a foot. Carts jammed the market turn, and 2 butchers argued over stall frontage while she moved between them, with her satchel held close. By the time she reached the print shop stairs, her breathing had steadied and the decision had become practical sequence. She barred the door, climbed to the attic, and began to pack. 1 bag, no second trip. She folded 2 shirts, 1 wool skirt, stockings, mending needle, penknife. She wrapped the pawn ticket for the pearl comb in waxed paper and tucked it into the inner seam. From beneath the loose floorboard, she drew the oilcloth packets of index leases and the duplicate objections already sanded and signed. She added the affidavits witnessed at the assembly rooms, the apothecary receipt marked paid by bearer, and the copybook where she had logged every change in dock row conditions by date and address. Physical evidence had weight. She felt it in her shoulder as the bag filled. Then she crossed to the press room below and opened the cupboard her father had once called his unfashionable archive, where he kept papers too inconvenient for gentlemen and too necessary to burn. At the back, behind old type trays, lay a narrow ledger bound in cracked red calfskin. Inside its cover, in her father's hand, was written 1 line. Covenant Trustees, Private. Ivy had seen the volume years ago and been told only, not yet. She turned pages now and found names, witness marks, and a set of initials repeated beside dock row parcels. A.H., not Elias. A.H. She did not stop to decipher further. She wrapped the ledger in cloth and slid it into the bag. By dawn the next morning, fog sat low over the square and left moisture on her lashes as she climbed the town hall steps, with the bag cutting into her palm. The front doors were not yet open to the public, but Mr. Fenn stood at the side entrance sorting notices with blue fingers and a face that suggested he had slept less than she had. Miss Hayes, he said, startled. It is not yet office hour. It is now, she replied, and set her bag on the stone sill. I require sworn filing. He glanced toward the corridor as if expecting rebuke to materialize from panelling. Chair Wilkes will not receive private disputes at dawn. This is not private. It is deed manipulation connected to municipal transfer. Please fetch the night registrar. Something in her tone made him move, without argument. Within minutes, the night registrar arrived, waistcoat unbuttoned, spectacles askew, irritation ready on his tongue, until Ivy began laying documents across his desk in clean order. Sworn objection in her own name. Request for open review of Hayes-linked deeds, copies of leases, indexed occupancy list, and the red calfskin ledger with her father's notation and trustee initials. The registrar's expression changed by small degrees from annoyance to professional caution. He lifted one page, then another. Miss Hayes, this filing names Mrs. Beatrice Hayes and Alderman Cole in potential coercive procurement. It does. That allegation, if unsupported, exposes you to penalty. Then record that I understand the risk. He hesitated. You are severing claim to family protection by entering this publicly. She met his eyes. Record that also. He dipped his quill, entered her statement into the register, and pushed the line toward her. Ivy signed with a hand that remained steady until the final stroke. She watched him sand the ink and stamp the filing seal. Evidence submitted, no longer hidden under floorboards. Mr. Fenn returned with a fresh notice sheet and hovered at the doorway. "What now?" he asked. The registrar answered before Ivy could. "Now we convene emergency review under chair authority with county witness." He looked at Ivy again, not unkindly. "You may wait in the side chamber. It will be a long morning." "I will wait in the room itself," she said. 3 hours passed before the chamber filled, and the delay sharpened every sound. Quills tapping wood, bench legs dragged into alignment, murmurs clipped short when officials entered. Ivy sat at the end of the long public table with her bag at her feet and her father's ledger in front of her, palms resting flat on either side, as if to keep it anchored to the present. Cole arrived late, flushed and furious under his composure. Beatrice entered 2 minutes later in dove-grey silk, gloved, chin lifted. She did not look at her daughter. Chair Wilkes called the room to order and read the filing title in a voice emptied of ornament. Open review of Hayes-linked covenants and Dock Row transfer standing. A stir moved near the rear doors. Ivy turned. Elias Hart entered in dark formal coat and plain cravat. No surveyor's satchel, no mud at the hem. At his right walked a War Office steward in navy with brass buttons catching the window light. At his left walked the county registrar carrying a locked dispatch box. Their pace was unhurried. No announcement preceded them, yet half the room rose by reflex before remembering itself. Elias stopped opposite Ivy's place at the table. In formal dress, his reserve looked less like anonymity and more like deliberate restraint. The grey of his eyes was unchanged. So was the stillness. Chair Wilkes cleared his throat. "Mr. Hart, state your capacity for this review." Elias unbuttoned one glove, placed it on the table, and spoke in the same measured cadence he had used on the first day she challenged him. Only now, every syllable landed with authority no one in the room could pretend not to hear. "I am Lord Adrian Hartwell, trustee to your father's covenant, and the deed bore my lesser name, so speculators would not follow the title." No one spoke for several beats. Ivy felt the sentence move through her memory and reassemble weeks of contradiction in exact sequence. The children's involuntary "sir" in the churchyard, the magistrate climbing the gallery stairs to take instruction. Legal precedents opened to the correct footnote before she asked, coins placed for the Dock Row pump without witness, medicine debts erased through a ledger entry that left no name and therefore no leverage. Not concealment for sport, concealment for function. Cole was first to recover sound. "This is irregular." The county registrar opened the dispatch box, withdrew sealed instruments and laid them one by one before Chair Wilkes. "It is registered," he said. privately indexed under wartime asset shielding statutes and renewed upon Mr. Hayes's death. Lord Hartwell's trusteeship is valid and current. Beatrice's gloved hand tightened once on the bench rail, then relaxed. Her face remained composed, but colour had left it with startling speed. Ivy did not look at her mother. She looked at Adrian Hartwell and saw, beneath title and legal architecture, the same man who had caught her papers before mud touched ink and told her not to lose them. He turned slightly toward her, formal still. "Miss Hayes, your filing forced this review into daylight. That was the correct action." It was not praise, it was recognition, cleaner and more binding. Chair Wilkes signalled the clerk. "Enter Lord Hartwell's declaration. Proceed to evidentiary sequence." Ivy opened her father's red ledger to the marked pages and slid it across the table towards the registrar, who bent over the entries with sudden intensity. Beside her, Adrian removed a second ledger from the dispatch box and set it parallel to hers so the lines could be matched in open view. Covenant initials, witness marks, transfer conditions, all aligning where Beatrice and Cole had assumed shadows would hold. The room leaned forward as paper did what argument alone could not. Ivy straightened in her chair, one hand on the edge of the table that had once dismissed her voice, and when the clerk asked for the next document, she answered, clear enough for every bench to hear, "I have it here. I have it here." The clerk took Ivy's ledger with both hands, as if the cracked red binding had become more dangerous than fragile in the space of a single hour, and passed it to the registrar for line comparison against the trustee book Lord Hartwell had brought from the dispatch box. Pages turned, sand hissed over wet ink. Chair Wilkes called for sequence, and the chamber that had once treated Ivy as interruption now waited on her voice to proceed. "Document 2, she said, laying out the packet tied with hem ribbon. "Tenant affidavits witnessed at assembly rooms on the 12th. Occupancy, payment history and repair notices by address." Cole made a sound of contempt. "Ballroom affidavits are social theatre." Adrian did not raise his voice. "Witness seals are municipal. They stand." Wilkes glanced at the magistrate's stamps, then to the clerk. "Entered." Ivy placed the apothecary receipt beside them, the words paid by bearer visible in Mr. Lyle's rigid hand. "Document 3. Medical costs during the Dock Row Fever Week, charged first to me and cleared anonymously. Submitted because petitioner burden was shifted off record while transfer was still pending." Cole spread his hands. "Charity is not legal ground." "It is when it masks control of outcome," Ivy said. Beatrice spoke for the first time since Adrian's declaration, her tone composed enough to pass for reason if one had not heard her in the study corridor. "My daughter confuses personal grievance with municipal duty. She has always preferred sentiment to order." Ivy turned one page in her notebook and did not look at her mother while she answered. "Order does not require fraud." Wilkes lifted his gavel. "We will have witness testimony on procurement and coercion. Clerk, call Mrs. Hayes's household maid listed in the sworn filing." A murmur passed the benches. The side door opened and the maid who had once tied Ivy's ribbons stepped into the chamber in plain grey, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched. She kept her eyes on the rail until she reached the witness stand. "Name," said the clerk. "Anne Lark." "You understand penalty for false statement?" "Yes, sir." Wilkes leaned forward. "State what you heard on the evening of the 19th in the study corridor." Anne swallowed once. "Mrs. Hayes told Alderman Cole, 'Ivy is not difficult, merely expensive. Once married, her signature secures the transfer and the cottages clear by quarter day.'" "Sir?" No one moved. Even the benches seemed to hold breath. Cole rose half out of his chair. "This is coached." Anne flinched, then steadied. "No, sir. It is what was said." Beatrice's gaze cut to the maid, cool and annihilating. "You have been paid for this disloyalty." Before Anne could answer, Ivy spoke. "I gave her a chain for her brother's apprenticeship in the front hall. I did not ask for testimony. She is here under oath because the line is true." Adrian turned his head slightly toward Ivy, a brief look that held recognition rather than surprise. The loaded pause in that townhouse corridor, the maid's unfinished "Miss Ivy," resolved in open record where Beatrice could not dismiss it as domestic insolence. Wilkes conferred with the county registrar in low tones. The registrar opened a second packet from the dispatch box, drew out 3 folded letters, and addressed the chair. "These were retrieved this morning from the Hayes Red dispatch case under seal order," he said. "Correspondence from Michael Hayes naming trustee succession and steward recommendation should conflict arise." He unfolded the first letter and read, "If my daughter Ivy chooses the burden, appoint her paid steward to Dock Row covenants. She reads households as obligations, which is the only reading that keeps peace. Dated and witnessed." The words struck Ivy below the ribs with almost physical force. Not praise, instruction. Her father had written it in the narrow practical script she knew better than prayer. Beatrice's composure broke by a hairline degree. "My husband was ill. He was manipulated." Adrian's answer was quiet. "The witness marks include your own." The registrar held up the page. Beatrice's signature sat at the bottom, unmistakable. By mid-afternoon, after 2 more deed comparisons and 1 failed objection from Cole that collapsed under his own mismatched dates, Chair Wilkes delivered findings in the same chamber where Ivy had once been told she had no standing. His voice carried to the back wall. "Emergency transfer under Hart Consortium is void as filed, due to coercive procurement attempt and suppression of covenant continuity. Alderman Cole is removed from Dock Row. Rates authority pending ethics censure review. Mrs. Beatrice Hayes is stripped of proxy control over Hayes-linked tenant instruments and referred for formal censure under civil misuse provisions." He paused, then read the final order. "Dock Row is hereby placed in protected tenancy under trustee oversight. Miss Ivy Hayes is appointed paid steward effective immediately. Compensation from Covenant Fund, reporting quarterly to this board." A sound rose, not loud but unmistakable, from the Dock Row benches. Relief released in fragments, shawls shifting, one man saying "thank God" into his hands. Wilkes looked to Ivy. "Miss Hayes, do you accept appointment?" She stood. Her hands trembled once and went still on the table edge. "I accept." "Then sign." The clerk turned the ledger toward her. Ivy signed where indicated, then passed the pen to Adrian. He signed beside her, his title now fully written for all to see, and the pairing of names on one line settled more than the room's gossip ever had. When the session adjourned, Beatrice stepped into Ivy's path near the chamber door. Up close, her face looked newly matte, as if one layer of polish had been removed and not replaced. "You have chosen spectacle," she said. Ivy met her eyes. "I chose daylight." Beatrice's mouth tightened. "Society has a short memory for women who defy their own house. Then it may relearn." It was 4 words fewer than Beatrice deserved, and enough. Ivy moved past her. Cole did not approach. Mr. Pike, who had once pushed ledgers toward Ivy with 2 fingers and no acknowledgement, held the side door open as she exited and said, without irony, "Steward Hayes, your duplicate register will be ready by morning." The title sat awkwardly in his mouth and correct in the air. By that evening, notice of the ruling was posted at Dock Row on the pump post that had failed the week before. Ivy stood with Mrs. Bell, Mr. Doran, and half the lane while Mr. Fenn read the order aloud so no one had to trust rumour. Doran's son, pale but upright in a blanket, leaned against his father's leg and listened solemnly. "Protected tenancy, Mrs." Bell repeated, touching the paper as if to test that ink could hold. "Paid steward means you are not carrying us on empty pockets anymore." "I am carrying forms now," Ivy said, and Mrs. Bell gave a dry laugh that turned into something softer. Mr. Fenn cleared his throat and handed Ivy a sealed envelope. "Advance stipend voucher from Covenant office. Chair said to place it directly in your hand." She broke the seal under the pump lantern. The amount was modest, precise, and real. She left Dock Row only long enough to cross Mill Street before shutters came down. At the pawnbroker, she laid the ticket on the counter with the first portion of her own earned stipend. "My comb," she said. The broker checked the number, disappeared into the back, and returned with the linen-wrapped parcel. "Redeemed within term. Rare." She opened the cloth, saw pearl and gold catch the lamplight, and closed it again. "Not rare. Timed." Back in the lane, she did not put it in her hair. She slipped it into her coat pocket and walked on, choosing to keep steel pins until morning. The next day, in full session and under clear windows, Ivy stood again at the long town hall table. This time she stood by invitation, not defiance. Lease repair schedules lay in ordered stacks. Mrs. Price's drain request sat on top with an approved seal. The broken pump reimbursement had been entered exactly as Adrian had instructed, not charged to tenants. Every physical piece she had guarded in oilcloth now lived in the municipal register, indexed and witnessed, where removal required more than a footman and a private command. When the last clerk departed and the chamber emptied to echo, Adrian remained at the table, removing his gloves one finger at a time. In private stillness, without gallery shadow or title announced by others, his face looked closer to the man in the surveyor's coat than to the peer at review. He touched the faint crease at his ring finger and gave her the answer she had never asked aloud. "I wore a signet for years. I removed it when I took the lesser name. The scar at my temple came from service, and the War Office taught me how quickly open titles attract the wrong men." She rested her palm on the ledger between them. "You tested everyone." "I tested systems," he said. A beat passed, "and I watched you." His gaze did not waver. "You argued law when it cost you shelter. You sold what was yours for a child who had nothing to offer back. You filed at dawn when fear would have been reasonable. I did not intervene sooner because I needed the record to stand on your strength, not mine." She took that in, all its burden and respect, braided together. "It stands now." "It does." He drew one folded document from his case and set it beside her hand. "Steward Charter. Co-signature required for any future Dock Row transfer, mine and yours." She read the clause, then looked up. "Equal signatory." "Yes." Outside, carriage noise drifted through the high windows, ordinary and distant. Inside, the room where she had once been dismissed held only two people and one clean line of future work. He spoke her name without title. "Ivy." It changed the register more than volume could have done. "Will you build the rest of this with me?" he asked, not as claimant and trustee, but as partners in the work. She considered him with the same precision she brought to ledgers and leases, and found no haste required. "Yes," she said, "we build it properly." He smiled then, rare and unguarded, and it transformed his face from disciplined reserve to something warmer, almost young. He offered the pen. She took it, signed beside him, and when they stepped from the table together, Ivy did not feel admitted into the room. She belonged there.